There are camps. The mountains swallow and never give back. In the summer of 1893, a timber outfit drove a crew into a hollow off the Black Fork in West Virginia, and the men began to vanish one at a time. The foreman told the rest that each man had run off with his pay. The snow told a different story, because a man cannot leave a camp in fresh snow and leave no boot prints. The account survived only because one man kept a ledger, and his daughter gave it away 40 years later. Before I go any further, look in the description of this video and the pinned comment at the top. There's a link there to something I put together called the Appalachian Dossier. It's a collection of accounts that were quietly erased from official American records between 1843 and 1891, reports filed by sheriffs and surveyors and country doctors that were burned or locked away or written over by men who decided the public should never read them. I gathered them. They're waiting for you. If what I'm about to share tonight makes the back of your neck feel cold, go to that link after the video and read what they tried to keep buried. Now, one more thing before we begin. Wherever you're listening from right now, your kitchen, a long drive, a quiet bedroom with the lamp on low, do me one favor and tell me in the comments which state, which country you're listening from. I read every one of them and I like knowing who's awake out there with me on a night like this. The account I have tonight reached me in a box a woman gave to the Tucker County Historical Society in 1934, 41 years after the summer it describes. Inside were a timber scaler's ledger, 3 water-stained letters, and a single page torn from a company report. Some pages had been torn out. Some had been written over in a later hand. The woman's father had kept the ledger through a summer he never spoke of, and she gave it away only after he was dead because he had asked her to give it to someone who would keep it. The place was a feeder hollow off the Black Fork in Tucker County in the Allegheny Mountains of eastern West Virginia. The Black Fork itself is a short river only about 4 miles long, formed where the Dry Fork and the Blackwater come together at a town called Hendricks, then running northwest through Hambleton to Parsons, where it joins the Shavers Fork to make the Cheat. The hollow I'm telling you about isn't on any modern map. The local people had a name for it that I won't print here, because the name was the kind of name men give to a place after something has happened in it, and the something had not happened yet in the summer of 1893. I came across the box the way a man comes across most of the things in the dossier, by following a name in a county record to a name, on a letter to a name, on a list of donations nobody had catalogued in 50 years. The ledger was water-stained and the binding was gone, and the first pages were missing, torn out clean, the way pages are torn when a man doesn't want the next reader to have them, and the pages that remained were in 2 hands, Pope's and one other. And the other hand, I'll let you guess. The letters were folded inside the ledger like bookmarks, and the single page of company report was tucked in the back, and the report didn't mention any of the men who had gone, which is itself a kind of report, because a page that should name the dead, and names none of them, is a page a man has cleaned. To understand how 23 men came to be locked in that hollow, with one man who held the keys, you have to understand what was happening in the mountains in 1893. Beginning in the 1,880 seconds, the southern Appalachians became the scene of a logging boom that would run until the 1,920 seconds, and it was financed almost wholly with capital from outside the region. Men with money in the cities bought timber rights they had never walked, then sent crews into hollows no road reached, to cut old growth that had been standing since before the country had a name. The camp on the Black Fork was one of those. It sat at the head of the hollow on a limestone shelf above the creek, a row of 4 bunkhouses, a cook shack, a company office, and a foreman's cabin set apart on the rise. The only way in or out was a logging railroad spur and a single timber bridge back to the line at Parsons, and the company had built the spur because no wagon road could reach the hollow in any season. The nearest town was a hard day's walk through broken ground, and in winter the hollow closed like a hand. The timber they had come for was the old growth, spruce and hemlock and white pine that had been standing since before any white man had walked the hollow. Trees 4 and 5 feet through the butt that dropped a deck of 10,000 board feet apiece when they fell. A camp like that ran on a skidder and a mile of cable, and the cable dragged the logs down to the landing where the scaler walked them, and the loaders stacked them on the cars, and the cars rode the spur out to the line at Parsons, and from there to the mill. It was loud work and heavy work, and it paid a man better than anything else he could do with his back and his hands. In 1893, which is why the men came and why they stayed when the hollow began to feel wrong, because leaving meant walking away from the only wages that would carry them through the winter. The men were shipped in by rail in May, most of them from camps in Pennsylvania and Maryland, that had already cut out a few local men from Tucker County who knew the country. They were there to take the season's cut, bank their pay against the winter, and get out before the first hard snow, because every one of them knew that a man caught in a hollow like that, after the snow came, was a man who might not walk out until spring, if he walked out at all. The company held their pay until the cut was delivered, which is how the company held the men. The supply room was locked, and the foreman kept the only key. The bridge was the only crossing, and the foreman decided when it was passable. The company rifle lived in the foreman's cabin. None of this was unusual for a camp in 1893. In remote places, where the work existed far from any town, the employer built the camp and the company man ran it, and the men accepted it because the alternative was no work at all. What was unusual was the man the company put in charge of this one. His name was Hiram Toland. He was 46 that summer, broad through the chest, with a long, sunburnt face and a beard he kept short with a straight razor every Sunday, whether the camp had hot water or not. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 20 years in the woods, the kind of hands that didn't quite uncurl all the way when they rested on a table. He had come west with the company out of a river camp in Pennsylvania, and the men who had worked under him before said he had pulled 2 men out of the cheat one spring when the water was running chest high and black, and that he had once walked a crew 40 miles out of a blown down stand in the October of 1889 without losing a man. The men who told those stories told them the way men tell stories about a foreman they trust, with the facts straight and the respect unspoken, and the stories were the reason the crew from Pennsylvania had signed on for the Black Fork season without asking questions. Hiram Toland was the kind of foreman a man signed on with, because a man who has pulled another man out of a river running chest high is a man who will not leave you in the woods when the work goes wrong. That was the man the crew believed they had hired, and for the first months of the season they were right to believe it, because Hiram ran the camp the way he ran everything, steady and even and without waste. And the cut came out of the hollow on schedule, and the men ate well, and the strong box counted right every Monday. He had a soft voice, and he almost never raised it. The men who worked under him said, you could tell Hiram was angry only because he got quieter, never louder, and when he got quiet the right thing to do was stop talking and do what he had told you to do. He did not drink. He did not lie, or if he did, no one in the camps had caught him at it. If Hiram Toland told you the creek would freeze on Tuesday, you set your pack accordingly. He hired and fired. He held the pay ledger and the strong box. He controlled the supply room and the company rifle. He decided when the bridge was passable and when a man had earned his draw. The men respected him because he had earned it the way a man earns it in a camp, by being right about the things that keep you alive, and by not asking anyone to do work he would not do himself. But there were 2 things about Hiram Toland that the men noted and did not question, because questioning the foreman in a camp like that was the same as leaving, and leaving was the same as giving up your pay. The first was his cabin. It sat apart from the rest on the limestone shelf at the head of the hollow, the one structure with a stone-lined root cellar beneath the floor, and the men were never invited inside it. The second was a second ledger he kept, in his own hand, on the table in that cabin, and no one was allowed to read it. A foreman keeps one ledger, the company's, and that ledger is open. Hiram Toland kept two, and the second one counted something the men could not name. The man who finally did name it was Leander Pope. Pope was 38 that summer, lean and quiet, a former schoolteacher from the valley who had taken to the woods after his wife died of a fever in the winter of 1889. He was the camp scaler, the man who walked the cut and measured and recorded the volume of every log and board feet, and he kept his own timber ledger in a careful, even hand, because a scaler's numbers were what the company paid on, and a man's reputation lived or died in his columns. He did not drink. He did not lie. The men who knew him said if Pope wrote a number down, you could bank on it the way you could bank on a foreman's word about the creek. And that was the highest thing a camp could say about a man. He had a scaler's habit, which was the habit of watching anything that did not add up, not from suspicion, but from the instinct of a man who spends his life checking other men's figures. He watched the timber, and he watched the pay ledger. And in the back of his mind, he watched the foreman. The summer ran the way a season runs in a camp like that. The timber cruiser walked ahead of the crew and marked the stands worth cutting. The fallers dropped the trees. The choker setters cabled the logs to the skidder, and Pope walked the decks with his rule and his ledger and wrote down what the mountain was giving them. The men worked 10-hour days and ate in the cook shack and played cards in the bunkhouses and banked their pay against the walkout, and the plan was the same plan every man in every camp had, which was to get clear of the hollow before the snow closed the bridge. Pope kept his ledger the way a careful man keeps a diary, with the date and the weather and the count, and in the margins the small things he noticed that did not belong in the company's book. His handwriting was steady, and even all that summer, the writing of a man recording careful facts, and the men who later read the ledger said it only changed once, on one page late in the season. We will come to that page. He had been a schoolteacher before he was a scaler, and the schoolteacher was still in the way he carried himself, in the care he took with a column of figures, and in the habit he had of writing down the things other men only said. His wife had been a woman named Ruth, who died of a fever in the winter of 1889, and the men in the camp said the woods had taken the place she left, and that Pope had gone into them because staying in a valley where every room held her was harder than walking a cut line in the cold. He did not talk about her. He kept her name inside the cover of his ledger, in pencil where no one but him would see it, and that is the kind of detail that tells you who a man is before you read what he wrote. The first man to go was Joseph Meeks, a faller in his middle 20s who had come down from a camp in Garrett County, Maryland. It was the last week of August. Meeks marked a stand of spruce up the north wall of the hollow in the morning, and did not come back to the cook shack by dark, which was not itself a worry, because a faller will sometimes work late to finish a deck and sleep under a lean-to rather than walk down in the black. The crew waited until first light, and then went up the wall after him. They found his hat on a stump and his axe leaning against the tree he had been cutting, and they found nothing else. The gorge below the stand dropped 200 feet into the creek, and they searched it for a day and a half. There was no body in the rocks. There was no sign on the trail. The spruce was half cut, and the saw was still buried in the kerf where he had left it, which is not how a man leaves a saw, if he means to leave. A man who walks out of a camp takes his axe, because an axe is a week's wages, and a man does not leave a week's wages leaning against a tree, and a man who falls into a gorge leaves a mark on the rocks, or a piece of cloth in the brush, and the men who searched the gorge found neither. They came back to the cook shack at dark on the second day, with their clothes torn from the laurel and their faces cut. And they sat at the long table and ate nothing and said little. And the little they said was the kind of thing men say when they are working out which explanation they are willing to live with. Most of them were willing to live with the foreman's explanation, because the foreman's explanation let them keep working and let them keep believing. The hollow was a place a man could walk out of, and a man will pay a great deal to keep believing that. Hiram Toland called the camp together in front of the office, and told them what had happened, calm and reasonable, the way a foreman tells a crew hard news. Meeks had drawn his pay against the cut early, the foreman said, and walked out down the railroad in the night, as men do walk out when the work gets hard and the whiskey runs out and the city starts pulling at them. It was a clean story. It was the kind of story every man in the camp had seen happen in another camp, and most of them nodded, because the alternative was worse, and because the foreman had been right about bigger things than this. Pope did not nod. He had the company pay ledger in his hands the next morning, because it was his job to reconcile the scaler's count against the draws, and there was no early draw for Joseph Meeks that week. The column was empty. He took the ledger to the foreman and showed him the empty column, and Hiram looked at it and said Meeks must have taken it from the strong box at night, and the numbers did not support that either, because the strong box was counted every Monday and the count had been right. Pope wrote a small note in the margin of his own ledger, the date and the name and the words "no draw," and he did not press it, because pressing the foreman in a camp that size was not a thing a scaler did if he wanted to walk out in November. The saws started up again the next morning, because the cut does not wait for a missing man, and the smell of spruce sap and river water was the same as it had been the day before, and most of the camp went back to the work of getting out of the hollow alive. The second man went in the second week of October, and he did not go from a stand up the wall. He went from his bunk, in the night, with the rest of the camp asleep around him. His name was Dunmore, a choker setter, a quiet man with a wife in Elkins, who kept a photograph of her folded inside his hatband. At roll call, the foreman called his name, and the name came back empty. And Pope walked the bunkhouse, and found the bunk stripped of its blankets, but nothing else. Dunmore's boots were still by the bunk, lace loose, as he'd laced them, meaning to put them on again in the morning. His coat was still on the peg. His hat, with the photograph inside it, was still on the shelf. Hiram Toland told the camp that Dunmore had taken a fever in the night and wandered out, or walked in his sleep, the way men do when the work wears them down and the cold gets in. It was a weaker story than the first one, and the foreman delivered it with less patience, and the men who heard it heard the thinness in it and did not say what they thought. The thing that broke the story was the snow. A wet snow had fallen in the night after Dunmore went, 2 inches of it, the kind that holds a boot print like a cast, and at first Light Pope and a young choker setter walked the full perimeter of the camp, from the tree line around the bunkhouses, and the cook shack and the office, and the foreman's cabin and back to the tree line. There were no tracks leaving the camp. None. The snow was unbroken from the trees to the bunkhouse door, and it was unbroken from the bunkhouse door to the trees, and a man cannot leave a camp in fresh snow without leaving the print of his boots in it. Pope and the choker setter walked the line twice. The second time with a lantern after the sun came up, because a man who does not believe what he has seen will look again in better light, and the second walk gave them the same answer as the first. The snow held the prints of the men who had walked out of the bunkhouses that morning, and the prints of the mule at the skidder, and the prints of the foreman's dog on the step, and it held nothing else. No boot going out, no boot coming in, no drag, no scuff, nothing between the camp and the tree line in any direction. A man who vanishes from his bed without his boots and without breaking the snow has not walked anywhere, and the only ground inside the unbroken snow was the ground under the roofs of the camp, and one of those roofs was the foreman's cabin on the limestone shelf. Pope wrote it down. He wrote the date and the name and the words "no tracks out," and he underlined "no tracks out." Then he sat on the bunkhouse step with the ledger on his knees and looked at the foreman's cabin on the rise, and did not say what he was thinking, which was that a man who vanishes from his bunk without his boots and without leaving a track has not left the camp at all. The crew turned that morning, not to accusation, because no one yet had a name for what was happening, but to fear. Men began sleeping with their axes across their knees. 2 of them moved their bunks against the wall so nothing could come at them from behind. The foreman posted himself at the strong box, and slept in the office with the company rifle across the table, and the camp, which had been a place of work, became a place of men watching the dark and listening. Before any man in that camp would say what he was starting to believe, the animals said it for them, the way animals do in a place where something is wrong. The camp mule was the oldest animal in the hollow, a broad black mule named for a town nobody remembered, and it had worked the skidder line for 3 seasons without balking at anything. In the last weeks of that summer, it began to refuse the path that ran past the foreman's cabin on the limestone shelf. It would plant its hooves at the foot of the rise and lock its ears toward the cabin floor and not move, and the men had to whip it past, and they hated whipping it, because a mule that has worked 3 seasons without balking is not balking out of stubbornness. A mule that has worked 3 seasons does not balk at nothing. The foreman's dog was a lean black animal that had gone everywhere with Hiram Toland since Pennsylvania, and the men were used to seeing it at his heels or under the office table. In the weeks after Dunmore went, the dog would not cross the threshold of the cabin. It slept outside on the stone step, facing the door, and in the night it whined at the floor in a low, steady tone the men had never heard from it, the tone of an animal that is looking at something it cannot reach and does not want to reach. Pope noticed the thing the men missed, because Pope noticed air the way a scaler notices a figure that is off by a quarter inch. On the still nights of October, when the wind dropped and the hollow held its breath, a faint draught of cold air rose from the gap beneath the cabin's stone sill, steady and cold even on nights when the ground should have been holding the day's warmth. The cabin sat on a limestone shelf, and the shelf, in that part of the country, was the kind of ground that is not solid all the way down. This is the part where the geology matters, and I'll keep it short. Eastern West Virginia sits on limestone and dolomite. The groundwater has been dissolving for millions of years, and the dissolving leaves voids under the ground, caves and stream passages and vertical shafts, some of them large enough to walk a man through. There is a place in the same national forest, not far from the Black Fork, where a whole stream runs into a hole in the ground and comes back up somewhere else. And the men of that country have a word for it. A camp built on a limestone shelf at the head of a hollow can be built on a cave, and the cold air rising from under the sill of Hiram Toland's cabin was the air of a cave, steady and cold and coming from somewhere below. Pope did not say any of this to the crew, because saying it aloud would have made it a thing the men had to act on, and acting on it meant confronting the foreman in a camp where the foreman held the rifle and the keys and the bridge, and a scaler with a theory and no proof was not a man who could win that confrontation. He wrote it in his ledger instead, in the small, careful hand he used for the things he was not yet sure of, and he wrote beside it the one fact a scaler trusts more than any other, which is that air moving where there should be no air means a space, and a space under a closed cabin means a way in and a way through. He told himself the cold air had a harmless explanation, a spring running under the shelf, an old drift from a mine nobody remembered. He was lying to himself and he knew it, but the lie let him sleep, and sleep was a thing the men of that camp were running short of by then. November came, and 2 more men went in a single week, and the crew, now under strength and falling behind the cut, went to the foreman and said they were walking out down the railroad before the snow closed the bridge. Hiram Toland refused them, as a man refuses a thing he has already decided, without heat and without room. The company will not pay a man who abandons the cut, he told them, and the supply room is locked, and I hold the only key, and the bridge is not safe, and I will not authorize a crossing. He offered to ride out alone down the spur and bring back the company's answer. And he rode out, and he was gone a week, and when he came back he told the camp the bridge had washed out in a freshet, and there was no crossing until the company sent a crew to rebuild it. Pope climbed the ridge that afternoon to a place where a man could see down to the line at Parsons. The bridge was standing, the timber was wet, and the rails were bright in the sun, and the bridge had not washed out at all. A young choker setter named Harkins decided to walk out anyway, alone, in the night, against the foreman's order, because Harkins had a girl in Parsons, and the idea of dying in a hollow for a cut he would never be paid for had begun to sit in him like a stone. They found him the next morning at the base of the hollow, below the spur, in a place where the ground fell away to the creek. He was dead, and there was no mark on him that any man could read from a distance, and his face was set in a way the men did not like to look at. The foreman called it a fall, and a fall was a thing that happened in a hollow like that. But the body was not where a fall would have put him, and every man who walked down to see him knew it. A man who falls from the spur lands at the bottom of the grade, in the rocks where the ground breaks, and Harkins was not in the rocks. He was 40 yards past the break, on flat ground by the creek, laid out on his back, with his arms at his sides, and his face to the sky, and there was no blood on the stones above him, and no mark on his clothes, and no reason a man who falls should end up laid out neatly on flat ground a quarter-mile from where he fell. The men who stood over him did not say what they were thinking, which was that Harkins had not fallen, and that the foreman, who called it a fall, knew that as well as they did. They carried him back to the camp and buried him above the hollow on a bench of ground where the sun hit in the morning, and the burial was quiet, and the foreman did not come to it, and that was another thing the men noted and did not say aloud. The camp broke into 2 pieces after Harkins. 3 men, 2 fallers, and the blacksmith decided to make a run for it together at the next snowfall, because snow would cover their tracks and 3 men could carry each other over the bad ground. The rest stayed, because leaving now looked like dying the way Harkins had died, and because the bridge was the only way, and the foreman said the bridge was out. Pope stayed, and he stayed for a reason he did not say aloud, which was that he had begun to understand the only way out of that camp was to know what was under the cabin before the foreman knew he knew. These were men with names and people at home. Men who had come to the hollow to bank a season's pay against a hard winter, and the mountain was about to close over them, and the man with the keys to the supply room, and the rifle, and the ledger, was the same man who was watching the tree line from his doorway at dusk, and getting quieter. Pope waited for the morning. Hiram rode down to the bridge to check the line, because the foreman rode down every 4th day, and was gone 3 hours. And on that morning Pope walked up the rise and through the door of the foreman's cabin, because the door was never locked in daylight. A foreman's cabin being the one place in camp, no man would enter uninvited. The second ledger was on the table open, and Pope read it standing up, and what he read he would not write down for 40 years. The trapdoor to the root cellar was in the floor, behind the stove a square of heavy planking with an iron ring, and he lifted it and lowered himself down the stone-lined shaft, and the shaft did not stop at a root cellar. It dropped through the shelf into natural limestone tunnel, a dissolution, void under the camp, and the air that rose up out of it was cold and steady, and 52 degrees, the way cave air holds the same temperature the year round in that part of the country. He went down with his lantern, and the descent is the part of his ledger where years later the men who read it said the world he was describing stopped being the world above the ground. The smell was wet stone, and something older than wet stone. The sound was water moving somewhere deeper than he could see, and the lantern light went out ahead of him and did not find a back wall, because the tunnel did not have one within the reach of his light. The passage ran level under the shelf for 30 paces, and then opened into a chamber where the ceiling rose out of the lantern's reach, and the floor of the chamber was dry and had been swept, as a man sweeps a room he means to use. That was the first thing that told Pope this was not a cave a man had stumbled into, but a place a man had made into a room. There were marks on the walls where a pick had been taken to the soft stone to widen the natural void, and the marks were fresh in some places and old in others, which told him the work had been done over a long time and not in a single season, and the knowing of that settled in him like cold water. The foreman had not come to the Black Fork in May with the crew. The foreman had been coming to this hollow for a long time before the crew arrived, and the hollow had been waiting for him the way a room waits for the man who built it. In the first chamber he found the belongings, and they were sorted and labeled in the foreman's careful hand. Joseph Meeks's boots were set against the wall, laced loose. Dunmore's coat was folded on a ledge with the hatband photograph inside it, the photograph of the wife in Elkins. There was a holy medal on a broken chain, a tobacco tin with a name scratched into the lid, a pocket knife with a man's initials, a letter from a mother in Pennsylvania, folded small and kept dry under a stone. They were the personal effects of every man who had vanished from the camp, arranged in order, not thrown or scattered like a man hiding things he is ashamed of, but arranged the way a man arranges things he is keeping. Pope counted the sets against the men who had gone, and the count matched, set for set, man for man. And beside each set the foreman had written a name and a date on a slip of paper in the same careful hand he used for the company ledger. Meeks, the last week of August. Dunmore, the second week of October. 2 more from November, with dates only days apart. The paper was kept dry under each man's things weighted with a stone, and the stones were all the same kind, the flat creek stones a man picks up out of one bend of one stream. The sameness of the stones was the thing that stayed with Pope longer than the belongings, because it told him the foreman had carried each one down the shaft by hand and set it in its place with the care of a man building a shelf. The second ledger was an inventory. Down each page went a name, a date, what the man had been carrying when he went, what he was owed in board feet and in cash, and a column the foreman had headed in his own hand with a word I won't print. Hiram Toland had been accounting for his men the way he accounted for the timber, by the standing volume and by what each unit returned to the company, and he had been keeping the second ledger the way a scaler keeps account, because a man who keeps account is a man who means to use it. There was a column at the far right of the page that held a single mark beside each name, the same mark, the mark a tallyman makes when a count is closed. Pope counted the marks and counted the names, and the 2 numbers were the same, and he understood, standing in the lantern light with the cold air on his face, that the marks were the record of men who had been finished the way a cut is finished, logged out and tallied and closed. He did not find his own name on the page. He found the names of the men who had gone, and beside the last one a date that was 3 days ahead of the morning he stood there, which told him the date a man was meant to go next, and the man was not Harkins, because Harkins had gone early and wrong, and the man was one of the 3 who were planning to run. I won't name what Hiram Toland was in a single word, because the inventory names it better than I can. A man who sorts the boots, and the photographs, and the holy medals of the men who worked under him into a cave, under his cabin, is not a man, any word in the language is large enough for. And the right thing to do with such a man is to set his own count in front of him, and let the count do the work. Pope was halfway up the shaft when he heard the horse on the rise, and by the time he crossed the cabin floor the foreman was in the doorway, and the foreman looked at the open trapdoor, and the lantern in Pope's hand, and the second ledger on the table, and he did not shout. He got quieter, the way the men said he always did, and he closed the door behind him and sat down across from Pope at the table, with the ledger between them. The reckoning was not a fight. Hiram Toland did not reach for the rifle on the wall, and he did not deny any of it, because a man who has kept an inventory in his own hand does not deny the inventory when another man has read it. He explained it the way a scaler explains a tally. Slow and even, with the patience of a man who has sat with the thing long enough to have made it reasonable to himself. The men were going to leave anyway, he said, the way Meeks left, the way they all leave when the work gets hard. The company would not pay for a short-cut, and a short-cut was what a walkout left him with, and the mountain took men every season in falls and in freezes and in the river, and he had only made the taking useful, the way a foreman makes the timber useful, because a man who runs a camp runs it on the count and not on the feeling. He told Pope that the hollow had been his before the company sent the crew, that he had found the shaft years back when he was a cruiser, walking the country for the company, and that he had known what the hollow was. For the first time he stood on the shelf and felt the cold air come up out of the ground. He did not raise his voice through any of it. He spoke the way a man speaks who has rehearsed a thing in his own head so many times that the words have worn smooth, and the smoothness of the words was the worst part of it, because a man who has to convince himself of a thing stumbles over it, and Hiram Toland did not stumble. He had counted the men the way he counted the trees, and he had filed the men the way he filed the board feet, and the ledger between them on the table was the proof that he had done it with the same hand and the same care. Pope listened to all of it, and he understood as he listened that he was not hearing a confession, because a confession assumes the thing confessed is wrong. He was hearing a balance sheet read aloud by a man who had decided his men were another kind of timber, and the horror of it was not in the killing, but in the calm, in the way a man could sort a dead man's boots and a living man's pay into the same column and call it accounting. He did not say any of that to Hiram Toland. He said the one thing that would get him out of the cabin alive, which was that the rest of the crew knew where he had gone that morning and knew what was under the cabin, and that if he did not walk out of the cabin now, the camp would come up the rise after him. It was a lie, and he knew it was a lie, and the foreman knew it might be a lie, but the lie was the thing between Pope and the stone shaft, because a foreman who has run a camp for a season on no one knowing cannot kill the one man who knows in the open without ending the camp and the season's pay he still meant to collect. Hiram Toland let him go. Pope walked out of the cabin into the November light with his own ledger inside his coat and the second ledger's count in his head, and the foreman stood in the doorway and watched him walk down the rise the way he watched the tree line at dusk, until Pope was inside the bunkhouse and out of his sight. Pope did not rally the crew that night. He took his ledger, and the cook, a man named Alvy, who had been in the camps longer than any of them, and who had stopped asking questions weeks ago, and the two of them walked out of the hollow in the dark, down the spur, and across the bridge the foreman had said was washed out. The bridge was standing, and they crossed it in the black, with the creek roaring under the timbers, and by morning they were in Parsons. And Pope sat down in the railroad office, and told the man behind a desk what was in the hollow, and the man behind the desk did not believe him, and then he read the ledger. And then he did. What happened after is the part the documents do not give in full, and I'll tell it the way the records tell it, which is in pieces. The county sent men back up the hollow before the snow closed it, and what they found was a camp still standing and empty. The bunkhouses were intact. The cook shack was intact. The office was locked, and the strong box was inside it, and the strong box was full, because Hiram Toland had not stayed to collect the season's pay he had been so careful to protect. The foreman's cabin had burned to its foundation stones, and the stone-lined shaft beneath it was open to the cold air, and the fire had been set from inside. In a way the men who read the ashes understood. The foreman's body was not found. Some of the belongings were recovered from the tunnels beneath the shelf, the boots and the photographs and the holy medal, and they were returned where a name could be matched to them. Several of the men were never accounted for, not as belongings and not as bodies and not as names on a list, and the tunnels went back farther than any man the county sent was willing to walk with a lantern, and the county did not send a man willing to walk farther than the first chamber. What they brought out of the first chamber they laid on a tarp at the landing, and a man from the railroad office wrote down each piece as it came up, the boots and the coats and the holy medal and the knife and the letters and the photographs. The list he made is the list that sits in the back of the ledger now, in a hand that is not Pope's and not the foreman's. Some of the things were claimed. The wife and Elkins came for the photograph and the coat, and a mother came from Pennsylvania for a letter, and the men who came to claim them did not stay in the hollow long enough to look at the shaft. The things that were not claimed went back into the box with the ledger, and the box went to Parsons. And from Parsons it went to the back room of the Historical Society, and there it sat until the woman opened it in 1934 and did not read it and gave it away. The account ends where the documents end. Pope's ledger stops in the middle of a sentence on the page where his handwriting changed the day he went down the shaft, and the letters after it, the ones his daughter gave the Historical Society, do not describe the tunnels again. He wrote to a man in Parsons once that he had kept a record and that the record was true, and he wrote to his daughter, years later, only that he wanted her to give the record to someone who would keep it after him, and that she should not read it until he was dead. The woman gave it to the Historical Society in 1934, the year her father died, and she did not read it, and she did not say where her father had spent the summer of 1893, and the ledger sat in a box in the back room of the Society's building in Parsons for a long time before anyone opened it again. The limestone shelf is still at the head of that hollow, and on still October nights the cold air still rises out of the ground. Hiram Toland's second ledger was never recovered. Pope's was. If you're still with me, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, the town, the country, the road if there's no town. I read every one of them.